Episode 3, Season 3 of A View from the Left Side, The Storm Before the Calm, was recorded on February 12, 2025. Segment 1, We Are the Storm. Hello, I'm Pamela Powers of Powers for the People. Welcome to my podcast, A View from the Left Side. The title of this episode, The Storm Before the Calm, is taken from a book by George Friedman, the founder of Geopolitical Futures. A good friend of mine gave me this book for Christmas because she knows that I have a goal of more book time and less screen time. Initially, I balked at the title of this book because I was not eager to read about a storm when we are living in the eye of a hurricane since January 20, 2025, with the inauguration of Donald Trump for president. One evening in January, when even the comic pundits were too depressing to watch, I had a gruesome murder novel or The Storm to choose from, and I chose The Storm. It's an excellent book, and we're going to talk a lot about it today. It's very insightful, and I really like the historic perspective it puts on what's going on in our country right now, how we got here, and the way forward in the future. So, stay tuned. Segment 2. Don't worry, it's just a phase. The storm begins with the original European adventurers and settlers who came to America and discusses in great detail the political, economic, and social forces that have shaped the United States through our history. Governments and countries have natural life cycles like people do. When current systems stop being effective and break down, dramatic changes are necessary to fix or replace the outdated systems. According to Friedman, the United States regime has two very predictable cycles that have been operating throughout our history. That is the 80-year institutional cycle and the 50-year socioeconomic cycle. The institutional cycle controls the relationship of the federal government to the rest of American society, and the socioeconomic cycle alters the dynamic of the American economy and society. Friedman writes, "The U.S. experiences political upheaval and societal unrest whenever these two cycles are about to shift. It's kind of like an earthquake and the shifting of the tectonic plates when these cycles change." Our first institutional cycle began in 1787 with the drafting of the Constitution right after the Revolutionary War ended. It lasted for approximately 78 years. During that time, war, invention, ingenuity, slavery, immigration, the Hamiltonian Bank, and more land transformed the 13 colonies into a vast united country with an infrastructure. Friedman calls Thomas Jefferson a philosophical genius and a small d Democrat. John Adams is a legal genius and a Federalist, and Ben Franklin a genius at living and an iconoclast, with being the most significant founding fathers. These three invented the United States regime, according to Friedman. The Declaration of Independence promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The framers of the Constitution created a government with three equal branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, and a system of checks and balances so those three branches could keep each other in line. The voters and this system of equal branches regulating each other was set up to keep the government going, to protect the republic, and prevent the rise of a monarchy in the future. Although I knew that Jefferson and Franklin were inventors, I never thought about the United States and our government structure as being inventions. Throughout the book, Friedman highlights the role of inventors, inventions, technology, and science in our nation's development and history. The United States didn't exist before the Constitution and the election of George Washington as the first president. Most other countries have been around for centuries, and their people have long familial roots and a common language and a shared history, much more so than the United States. In contrast, we are a nation of immigrants with many cultures, many languages, and many religions, and we live in states that are very different from each other and are still different from each other in politics, culture, geography, and resources. That's a lot of diversity for a country whose current government is trying to deny that diversity exists. But I digress. Although the Founding Fathers and the original voters were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, WASPs, the founders did consider the economic and geographic diversity of the states when they tried to balance power between the northern industrial states, which were dotted with small towns and family farms, and the southern agrarian states with large plantations that depended on slave labor. The steady stream of immigrants helped fill our country's needs for industrial workers, farmers, soldiers, and settlers. Franklin and Jefferson decided that the U.S. needed a unifying symbol to bring the 13 distinct colonies together as one country. The Great Seal of the United States of America is sort of a graphic pep talk. We're all in this together, people. The first Secretary of State created the Great Seal, and it's packed with symbolism. It features the bald eagle, one of the largest birds of prey in the United States, with an olive branch in his left talon and 13 arrows of war in his right talon. You better watch out for that dude. In his mouth, there is a banner that says, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. The reverse side of the seal features an unfinished pyramid. This is a symbol for our unfinished country that's still being built. Atop of the seal is a triangle with an eyeball in it. This is the Eye of Providence. It also looks like the eyeball symbol for the Freemasons, which were a group of very influential Protestant men in the founding of this country. It also, on the backside, it has two more Latin inscriptions. You might realize from my pronunciation of Latin that I didn't take Latin. And so those inscriptions on the backside are Anut Coptis, he has favored our undertakings, and Novus Ordo Selectorum, a new order of the ages. Pretty heady stuff for a ragtag group of 13 colonies who were very different from each other and still are. You'll note that it says, he has favored our undertakings. It does not say God or Jesus Christ anywhere in any of these documents. I just want to clarify that. There is a big he there, but they don't say God or anybody else. Segment 3, Cycling Through U.S. History. The first institutional cycle of the U.S. was one of creation and expansion. Leading up to the Civil War, there was great strife and division in the United States. For decades, abolitionists in free states like Ohio openly defied the federal government and helped slaves escape to Canada by way of the Underground Railroad. There was a moral tension in a country that preached life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but considered African slaves to be subhuman, 3/5 of a white man. In the South, slaves were property and free labor was integral to the plantation economy. In the North, which was dotted with small towns, abolitionist ministers of the Second Great Awakening preached that slavery was against the will of God and should be abolished. Ohioans also believed that their free state constitution should supersede the federal government, and that's why they stood against the Fugitive Slave Act. These two anti-slavery positions should sound familiar. That's against my religion, and that's a states' right issue, are still being used as arguments today, more than 100 years later. The second institutional cycle began in 1865 after the end of the Civil War and the drafting of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the abolition of slavery, the initiation of birthright citizenship, and the right to vote regardless of race. It lasted until 1945 and the end of World War II. After the upheavals of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, the reforms of the New Deal, and World War II, the third institutional cycle strengthened the federal government. The New Deal programs that shaped the economy and society, like the jobs programs, food stamps, the minimum wage, and Social Security, were carried on into the future. President Lyndon Johnson and his all-Democrat Congress built upon those structures in the 1960s with the War on Poverty, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the establishment of a permanent food stamp program, the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, and Head Start. There was a lot going on in that cycle. 60 years later, all of these programs are under attack by the new Trump administration. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and his nonviolent civil rights movement exposed racism in the U.S. and pushed Johnson and the Democrats to change the laws. If you want to learn more about it, you ought to watch the movie Selma. It's very good. It talks a lot about the negotiations between Martin Luther King Jr. and Johnson and how much King really pushed the Democrats to act on civil rights. Alongside the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, we saw the rise of the anti-war movement, feminism, gay rights, labor unions, black power, and environmentalism. People wanted change. You can see that another change is coming when upheaval comes in the populace. Segment 4, The Rise of Feminism. Friedman credits American women factory workers, not the warrior men, with winning World War II. Hundreds of thousands of women, many of whom had never worked outside of the house, like my grandma, donned overalls and went to work in the factories building ships, tanks, and the weapons of war. What was their reward? All of them were fired when the men came back from World War II. It's not surprising that we saw the rise of feminism not long after this. During the third institutional cycle, the invention of birth control pills, the legalization of abortion, the sexual revolution, the passage of Title IX laws to prevent sex discrimination in education and employment, and the Equal Opportunity Commission to enforce those laws, all dramatically changed the lives of women in the United States. Historically, the woman's role in society and the family was to have as many children as possible, even if she died trying, and that often happened, obviously. With birth control and access to abortion, an American woman in the modern age could choose how many children she had. Instead of having 8 or more children and then spending her entire life caring for them and their father, a woman could choose to have 1 or 2 children or none and have a life outside the home. With advances in birth control and medical care, instead of having a life expectancy of around 40, American women now have a life expectancy of almost 80 years. World War II's Rosie the Riveter showed her daughters and her granddaughters that they could have a different life if they had a job and independence. The changing role of women in the United States over the past 50 years has changed relationships, family life, child rearing, and marriage. Men have not adapted well to this new reality, but you know what? We're not going back. The current backlash against women and our rights is not a smart long-term strategy. The old system is broken and needs to change. Segment 5, Backlash in the 21st Century. Preceding the end of each socioeconomic cycle, there are years of upheaval and social unrest. It's as if the country is fighting against itself and trying to tear itself apart, Friedman writes. People are frustrated and angry because the old systems are broken and need to be replaced, but people in power cling to the old strategies and deny that there are problems. Does this sound familiar? We heard this in the 2024 election with the Democrats telling us that everything is fine and Kamala Harris saying there's nothing she would do differently. Kamala Call me. I could have given you a list of what we could do differently. This was really, really a discouraging answer when you said, no, everything's fine. It's not fine. In 2020, Friedman wrote that if the 80-year institutional cycle continues to be predictable, the fourth cycle will begin around 2025. Yikes, we're here. And it will redefine the relationship the federal government has with itself. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but he did predict also a backlash against the technocrats, and that's what we're seeing with the Trump and Musk regime now, is they're going after those bureaucrats in the federal government. Unfortunately, according to Friedman, we're also facing a double whammy in this decade because the 50-year socioeconomic cycle is also supposed to shift. So we have two earthquakes happening at the same time in this decade. Interestingly enough, Friedman says that at the end of a cycle, there's always a failed presidency. This person, according to Friedman, is elected during a time of turmoil, but he tries to fix the problems using old strategies and broken systems to solve the new problems. Clinging to the past, of course, doesn't work. Change finally comes with the next presidential election. So let's look at 2028, people. Comes with the next presidential election and that begins the new socioeconomic cycle. And so I think that these cycles and these patterns in our history are fascinating. So let's take a little trip down memory lane. The first 50-year socioeconomic cycle began with President George Washington and ended with President John Quincy Adams, the son of President John Adams. The second cycle began with the election of President Andrew Jackson, who was the first president of Scotch-Irish descent and the first from west of the Appalachian Mountains. I mentioned this because even though the English, who originally settled the United States along the eastern seaboard, and the Scotch-Irish were both from the British Isles, the Scotch-Irish were put down and looked down upon as less educated, and so it was a big deal for one of them to become president when Andrew Jackson became president. The end of this cycle came with President Ulysses S. Grant. He was the failed president of the cycle because he was just overwhelmed by the financial aftermath and the politics after the Civil War. The third cycle began with President Rutherford B. Hayes and ended with President Herbert Hoover, who was infamously stingy with the unemployed people in the breadlines during the Great Depression. Hoover is a great example of a president using old ideas to tackle a new reality and making everything significantly worse. The fourth cycle began with President Franklin Roosevelt, who made sweeping governmental and societal changes to tackle the Great Depression, to put people back to work, and to beat fascism during the World War. That cycle ended with President Jimmy Carter. Taxes on the wealthy remained high during the fourth cycle. The union movement and the middle class grew. Many people became homeowners and college graduates thanks to federal government programs. The fifth economic cycle, which we're currently in, began with President Ronald Reagan, who championed low taxes for corporations and the rich. Reagan claimed that their wealth would trickle down and benefit the rest of us. Well, we all know that that never happened. Reagan aggressively cut taxes for the wealthy and started a 50-year trend of widening economic inequality in our country. The middle class shrunk, work-life balance eludes workers who work in the gig economy, poverty and homelessness have been steadily increasing, billionaires are becoming trillionaires thanks to the tax breaks and the lucrative government contracts, the deficit has ballooned because of decades of tax cuts, and most notably the unaffordable Trump Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was passed on a party line vote with no debate during Trump's first term. Although the system is obviously broken, Trump plans to continue feather-bedding the rich and ignoring the rest of us in his second term. Segment 6. Tired of the trickle-down. Given the history we just discussed, is Trump the failed president at the end of the fifth socioeconomic cycle? Like Hoover, Trump is ignoring the current problems of the country and clinging to failed strategies of the past, like tax cuts for the rich and deregulation. That is so 1980. There's always unrest toward the end of a cycle. No one can deny that since the beginning of the 21st century, the U.S. has experienced much upheaval, anger, and division relating to continuous war, the dot-com crash, the housing crash, the Wall Street crash, the invention of the smartphone, the invention of social media, the invention of gig economy spot labor apps, the invention of artificial intelligence, the COVID pandemic, and massive loss of human life, housing, and employment because of all of this. This is not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On top of all this strife, in 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States put down the Citizens United decision, which said that corporations are people and money is speech. This blew up our election system. Our elections, even before 2010, were already stupidly long and expensive, but since the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United, it has opened the floodgates of money, especially non-transparent, dirty money, into our elections. And in 2024, oh great, we got crypto dirty money in our elections. This system is broken. Votes should control who gets elected, not money. In 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement reminded us that we are the 99% and that the banks got bailed out and we got sold out during the Wall Street crash. Occupy rallied people against the greed of the 1%. There were Occupy encampments and marches all over the world. Activists used social media to communicate and to organize. In 2016 and in 2020, Senator Bernie Sanders shocked the political establishment by telling voters that the U.S. system is rigged against us. He was right, and everybody cheered. He also shocked the establishment by refusing big money donations and running his presidential campaigns on small donations and people power. In his book, Friedman says that the turmoil and ill will generated by the 2016 election and the statistical tie between Trump and Hillary Clinton, with him winning the Electoral College and her winning the popular vote, and the election of Trump, are all signs of unrest before a cycle shift. I contend that Bernie's popularity in both 2016 and 2020 races showed that people on both sides of the aisle, people on the left and the right, were both upset with the status quo and the establishment candidates. The billionaires played both sides of the aisle in the 2024 election. Although Trump had the richest men in the world on his side, Kamala Harris had plenty of billionaires on her side also. The billionaires want the costly Trump Tax Cut and Jobs Act to be renewed. That will only increase the deficit and make the bad situation worse. The renewal of a massive tax cut for the rich won't help the people who have lost their jobs or their homes, can't find affordable housing, and can't pay their credit cards or their student debt. The Trump-Musk regime isn't helping people like that. They're doing the opposite. They're creating havoc in thousands of people's lives. The co-presidents are firing tens of thousands of government workers and deporting potentially millions of undocumented workers. Their cruelty toward people in need is unprecedented. Hoover looks like a tone-deaf bungler compared to Dr. Evil and Mini-Me, who are controlling Washington, D.C. now. Throughout our history, at points of crisis, the country reinvents itself. The transition that clearly illustrates this is when the capitalist sympathizer, Hoover, who ignored the hungry and the homeless, lost to Roosevelt, who built a welfare state and the bureaucracy to feed and employ people during the Great Depression. Roosevelt's actions represented a dramatic and historic change in policy to address the crisis at hand. Trickle-down economics created our current problems. It won't fix them. It is a failed and obsolete system. Our election system based on money, our politics based on two parties, and our economic system based on capitalism and greed are also broken systems. If you look at Friedman's book, we have a lot of systems that are pissing people off and making us frustrated because they're all broken and our leaders are not doing anything about any of them. Common themes throughout our history. Besides the recurring institutional and socioeconomic cycles, there are many recurring themes in our nation's history. For example, war, breakdowns in the banking system, boom and bust economic cycles, scapegoating immigrants, preferential treatment for the wealthy, deal-making and promise-breaking, political corruption, political opportunism, taking land, violence, fear, discrimination, racism, sexism, hard work, frugality, creativity, and invention. If you look at the repeating cycles and the themes, big changes often come with war, immigration, and new inventions. Our country and our government were invented by the founding fathers. Our country was built by immigrants and slaves. The creativity of our people gave us a slew of inventions that have changed the world. For example, the steam engine, the locomotive, airplanes, telegraph, light bulb, phonograph, automobiles, self-driving technology for automobiles, drones, moving pictures, birth control pills, vaccines, personal computers, the internet, telephones, smartphones, social media, electrical generation, and very recently, artificial intelligence. That's a lot of creativity. Can we invent our way out of the current crisis? Several Silicon Valley inventors backed Trump in the 2024 election, donated money, and had front row seats at his inauguration. But those men are not going to save us this time around. They kissed Trump's ring because they want continued status quo. They want to keep their corporate tax breaks and their lucrative government contracts. They are protectionists who want to keep their privilege and their favored financial positions. Protectionism and greed breed stagnation, not creativity and invention. Immigration brings new people, new ideas, new invention, and fresh creativity, but they want to tamp that down. They don't want the immigrants coming. They want to keep things for themselves. That is not a good path forward, this protectionist path. In the last section of The Storm Before the Calm, Friedman talks about how the average Americans distrust the federal government, distrust the technocrats who run the government, don't like the universities who are educating the technocrats, and they also distrust the news media. The right has Project 2025 to guide them. The Trump-Musk regime is cranking out executive orders, proposing tariffs, threatening land grabs, backing out of agreements, deleting government information, and firing technocrats at a furious pace. And it hasn't even been a month since the inauguration. I would love for Trump to be the last failed president at the end of the trickle-down economics era. But what is our plan for the future? We'll talk about that in a future podcast. Thank you for listening to A View from the Left Side today. For now, this is Pamela Powers signing off. If you like this podcast, please subscribe, like it on social media, make a comment, and share it with your friends. In the meantime, please take care, be healthy, and stay vigilant. See you next time.